Hey everybody. So my clock is showing 2, so but I'm going to give people 2 more minutes to get joined here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So please sit tight, and we'll go ahead and start at 2 minutes after the hour. Hey everybody, if you've just joined us, welcome. I'm going to give people 1 more minute to go ahead and get connected. So please just sit tight, and we'll start at 2 minutes after the hour. Welcome everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, CMMC 2.0, Scoping for the DIB. Applying the scoping guide to levels 1 and 2. My name's Kevin Hancock, and before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping details. So today's webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour, and that includes a Q&A session. A large portion of today's event is dedicated to answering the pressing questions from the audience, and we'll be answering those questions that have been submitted prior to today's event. When you signed up, you were given the opportunity to ask some questions. We've compiled those, and we'll answer as many of those as we can today. In case you do experience an outage within the webinar today, please just wait for a minute, refresh the page, and it should go ahead and restart. For your convenience, there is a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms, acronyms, and initializations that will be referenced during today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on demand via the Exostar resource library. This can be found at www.exostar.com/resources. This will be available anytime post-event. You can also find the recording at the YouTube link in the email that brought you here. If you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts or request a copy of the slide deck that's used today, please reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. There's also a live chat feature on Exostar's website, www.exostar.com, if you'd like to request it that way as well. So as I mentioned, my name's Kevin Hancock. I'm Director of Solutions here at Exostar. Joining me today is Kyle Lai at KLC Consulting. I'll let Kyle introduce himself as he launches into his presentation. And with that, I'll let Kyle take it away. You're muted, Kyle, just to let you know. Oh, just give Kyle just a second, folks, while he gets unmuted there. There we go. I think you're
Okay.
Kyle. There we go. All right.
Sorry,
No
I'm trying to
problem.
actually find this, but oh, I'm sharing my screen, so that's why it changed the
It
position of
hides
my
the bar.
controls.
Exactly. It hides
I'm
the
sorry.
control.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be here. So my name is Kyle Lai, President and Chief Information Security Officer at KLC Consulting. So KLC Consulting, we are a C3 PAO candidate company. That means in order to authorize in the future, we will also get certified by by DoD and the CMMC, and then we'll start authorizing, and then we'll be authorized to assess the organizations for the CMMC certification. So we're helping the small to medium-sized defense contractors preparing and guiding them and help them prepare for the CMMC NIST 171 DFAR, meeting the DFAR compliance requirements. About myself, very quickly, I have 25 years of experience. 20 years of them are in the cybersecurity, and been in the assessment and the IT audit space for a while, and have been in the Defense Information System Agency, DISA, for a couple of years. And now I've been focusing on helping the small to medium-sized defense contractors, especially in the manufacturing and the aerospace area. So really glad to be here. Thank you so much. Okay, and we'll just want to see that, yes, we are going to talk about why we want to define the CMMC CUI scope, right? And also what should be in the CUI scope, the CMMC scope. How do we do the scoping properly? And we are going to discuss just an example of what are some of the challenges. And these are going to be some of the acronyms we're going to use today. Not going to go through them, but here are just some highlights. So let's talk about the scoping. So in terms of scoping, CUI scoping or CMMC scoping, DoD, they have created and distributed the CMMC scoping guide that was published around December 2021. So that's been available. But as you read through it, it might be a little bit confusing. But why do we actually need to do the scoping? And the reason is that we have seen some of the clients, our clients, that when we walk in, it's like, show us the scope. And that they will just say, what do you mean scope? Everything is in scope. And it's like, what do you mean? Do you have accounting system, financial system? Do they actually have the CUI information? If they say no, it's like, why do you need to include those in your scope, right? So these are the type of things that you really want to scope properly. Another extreme example is like we went to a company that will show us like, here's our scope. What is your scope? It's like one server, one file server, one folder. That's all. It's like, how about all the other firewalls and VPNs? It's like, no, we only scope it for one folder. So that's another extreme. It's like you probably scope it too narrow, right? We have to make sure that we understand what are the requirements so we can properly scope it. And so when you actually put in the controls, it's not going to steering you into the wrong direction, right? So you have the right focus and the right assets that should be in scope. So that's why we want to scope it properly. And you want to, once you scope properly, you will understand what are the specific CUI assets that should be in scope, right? And what are some of the controls that you put in place for these assets. And also the business units, the people, right? The roles within some of your business units that actually handling. When we say handling, we usually mean processing, storing, or transmitting the CUI, right? You have to make sure that you train the people that are in your scope, right? And make sure that they understand how to handle the CUI. So without having the scope done properly, I think you are missing the actual assets and the people who are handling it. So that's why we want to make sure to have companies that have to meet the CMMC 1.0, 2.0, they have the proper scoping. And also, you just need to make sure that you understand what systems are out of scope as well. That's pretty important, right? As we mentioned, your financial system, accounting system, if they don't have CUI, not specifically for the contract, you don't have to make them in your scope, right? Okay, so let's take a look at what are some of the, just a very high level process in terms of how do you go about determine your scope. The first thing you have to know is to determine what type of CUI you have within your organization. If you don't know what CUI you have within the organization, it will be very difficult for you to plan it properly, right? Because if you don't know what type of CUI you have, how do you know which system are processing CUI? So that is the first thing we have to resolve, right? Determine what CUI do you have within your organization. What do you support for the contract, for the government DoD contract, right? And because we are talking about CMMC, so our focus is going to be more on the DoD specific CUI, CUI assets and CUI data that we're talking about today. And in terms of the CUI, once you determine what type of CUI you handle, then we'll introduce the concept of CUI data lifecycle or data flow. So once you walk through that data flow, you will have a pretty good understanding in terms of what systems are considered CUI asset. And then based on that understanding of what is in scope, then you can very clearly identify what are some of the inventory, asset inventory, what system you have to include in your asset inventory. Okay. So before we go too far, how do we determine what systems or what is CUI, what kind of CUI you have within your organization? You obviously want to check your contract. If you already have a contract, specifically identify what CUI is within your contract. I know that's a draw of luck sometimes because they don't specify CUI within a lot of contracts that you may already have. So, but check your contract first. That's the first thing you will do usually. And also, if they did not really specify what kind of a CUI, what kind of sensitive unclassified information that need to be protected, then we will have to fall into the CUI registry. CUI registry, there's a DoD CUI registry, and there's a NARA, that's a National Archive CUI registry. DoD CUI registry is pretty much a mirror of the National Archive, the NARA CUI registry. And within this CUI registry, it specifies how do you, the category of the CUI. So one of the area that we probably most interested in is the defense. There's a defense category, and within that defense, there are a few different subcategories. Control technical information, and the critical infrastructure and the nuclear related information. But we're really going to be focusing on, a lot of the company, most of the clients that we work with in the manufacturing or in the engineering, aerospace area, they usually have the control technical information. So let's use that as an example. If you go into the defense industry, if you click on the control technical information, the subcategory, you will see this screen. And this is a copy of what's shown from the National Archive. You see this is a big blob of category description. I don't know why they make it so very difficult to read, but this is the description of they give you a description of what is the category and also give you an example here. But to make it easier, I make it a little bit easier to read. So here are some of the examples they listed on the right side. So for example, control technical information, there are research, data, the engineering data, specifications, manual, software code, for example, right? So these are the things that you want to read and to see if these are some of the information, CUI information that are in scope within your organization, and also your contract. Okay. So let's go forward. So once you understand what kind of information is included as a CUI information within your organization, so you want to just take a quick look. This is what's defined as what you should include in the CMMC scoping guide, and they kind of specify you have to identify these type of CUI within your CUI scope. First one is very clear, is the CUI assets. These are the assets that process, transmit, or store CUI. Very clear. We are going to go through the CUI data lifecycle in the next couple slides. So I'll walk through that. How do you determine the CUI assets? The second one is the security protection assets. Security protection assets, these may or may not have the CUI, but they are used to protect the CUI information. And these could be the firewall, VPN, your SIEM, the security information, and event management or endpoint protection, some of your antivirus, for example. These are security protection assets. The contractor risk managed assets, these are the systems that could handle the information. However, they are prevented by, from handling, storing, transmitting the CUI information based on the policy, procedures, and practices. Specialized assets, these are specialized assets that could be the Internet of Things. For example, there may be some sensors that you have within your SCADA systems, the operating technology, the OT, the SCADA, or the industrial control systems. It's pretty common for you to find this in the manufacturing facilities. Some test equipment, if you are doing some characteristic testing or stress testing, you probably know what I'm talking about. You will have some test equipments. Restricted information system, these are systems that you are implementing specifically based on the government requirements and used to support the contracts. And there are some government properties. These are some of the properties in your organization. However, these are owned or leased by the government, by the DoD. And the last one is the out of scope assets. If you have some assets, you just want to make it clear these are out of scope assets. You can include that into your boundary, the diagram, when you define your scope. Okay, so let's take a look at the CUI assets. How do you define what is CUI asset? As I mentioned earlier, these are going to be assets that process, transmit, or store CUI. So we usually like to use this as a methodology for us to define, because once you understand how this works, it'll help you tremendously in terms of how to define what is CUI. So very first step, start from the top. We are going to evaluate to see what is CUI by how do you get the CUI information into your organization. So these are the CUI. How do you get the CUI input to your organization? And also, how do you create this information, right? When we're talking about the CUI input, this could be the information you get, you download, or how do you receive this information from your DoD or prime contractors. And also creation is how do you create this information, the CUI information, from your own organization. So if you create some drawings based on the parts that you receive from your customers, for example, you are creating some of the specifications, or you are creating some technical analysis report, right, based on the specification that provided by the DoD, you are creating some CUI information, right? So these are the things that you want to identify. How do you actually create this information or get input? Once you have this information, the next step is where do you store this information, right? Do you actually store on the cloud, or do you store this in the on-prem system somewhere? Is that going to be in an email, or is it on the folder somewhere, your hard drives? Where do you store this information? who is managing this storage. You want to get a little bit understanding in terms of where do you actually store this information, right? And the next is how and who have access to this information. This is the CUI usage. And when we're talking about the usage, really means the people, right? People and the technology and the applications. What devices have access to the CUI information, right? And for example, if you have some kind of a CRM, sorry, not the CRM, but like a manufacturing resource planning system, or do you have some test application? Or if you have like SolidWorks, for example, very popular, right? SolidWorks application that are within the manufacturing and the aerospace organizations, right? That's for you to actually do the drawing, and that you have to access the drawing stored in your file server, for example. Or maybe like some of the QA applications. You want to identify these type of applications and who within your organization can touch this CUI information, right? And so the next one is going to be the CUI. How do you share the CUI information? You share the CUI information with your subcontractors, maybe some of your partners, or your customers. You are sharing this information back to your customers. How do you share that information? Do you use email, or do you use the secure file share to actually share this information, or email, or do you actually use the FedEx, right? So these are the information you probably want to identify. And when we are talking about CUI, these are really paper or electronic information. I just want to be clear. And once you identify who do you share it, how do you share that information, then you identify the systems, the applications that you use for sharing as well, right? The next one is the backup and archiving. How do you do the backup of your CUI information? Is that on-prem or in the cloud? Where is that located? Who is responsible for maintaining it, right? Is that yourself, or do you outsource that to somebody to do this for you? If you outsource it, you want to take that into consideration as well. And also, by the end of your project, how long do you store your information, your CUI? How long do you store it? What is your policy for storing it? You probably want to get a little bit understanding there as well. So at the very last step is the disposal or destruction of the CUI, right? At the end of the life cycle, if you no longer need that information, CUI, you probably want to destroy it. How do you destroy it? Who is destroying it? Is that yourself, or do you outsource it to some other company to do it, right? So you want to take them into consideration as well. One of the example I usually like to bring up is printers, right? Printers, big printers that you lease or buy, the big ones. They usually have a hard drive within the printer, and if you have everything that you print, scan, fax, or whatever you do on that printer, it will have every single copy from day one on the hard drive, right? So if you want to give this back, lease this up, you want to give this back to your vendor, make sure you take that into consideration. Take out your hard drive and wipe it before you return it. That's always a interesting discussion. I mean, some people know about it, but not too many people knew about it. Okay. So now, who should be involved in the CUI scoping discussion? This one is very interesting. A lot of time, it will just point straight to IT. It's like, IT, you take care of it, right? Give it the scope, everything should be all done. But in reality, we usually like to involve people, the different business units within the organization, so they can tell us like, hey, when you receive it, it may not be IT, be the very first person that's receiving that CUI information, right? So the person who is receiving this information might be the engineering department or procurement or your business or your salespeople, right? So when you receive this information in, you want to discuss with them how do they receive this, what kind of a system, or if they are using any other applications to store this information. And sometimes they'll be surprised. And it's like, yeah, well, I received this information. I put it on my OneDrive, personal OneDrive, until I need to, I need to translate into something. Excuse me. So it will be very interesting to see like what other groups are doing with this type of information. And it's always a very eye-opening experience when you see different groups that are discussing and they don't know each other's process. So I will encourage to have all these different groups when they get together and discuss quality assurance. They may be touching it, but they may be using some application or equipments that you don't know about. So you want to take that into consideration. And also when we are talking about the CUI scope, we're really talking about the scope to include the people, technologies, facilities, because you might have more than one facilities, and also the external service providers. So let's start with people. People, these are the employees, contractors, or, could be your vendors as well, right? If you outsource these to another IT firm support, or external service provider or managed service providers, you want to include those people. When you actually think about the people who might touching it, you probably want to take them into consideration. When we talk about the technologies, as we mentioned, it could be the servers, laptop workstations, right, the regular computers, but also take a look at the security components, firewall, VPNs, applications, databases, devices, right? And facilities, think about this. There might be a different cage code. When you are talking about the facilities, that one cage code, multiple cage code, and do you want to consider multiple cage code, or do you actually have one cage code with multiple facilities? So I think these are things that you want to consider, and there might be primary office, satellite offices. You want to take that into consideration as well, right? Don't forget there are secure room data centers as well. And your external service providers, and these are the cloud, could be the cloud service providers. They could be your infrastructure or your platform as a service, software as a service, or just your data hosting service or your web hosting if you have some sensitive information that's hosted in your web hosting service providers. So these are the things that you probably want to, these are the different components you want to take that into consideration. So as we have, just want to do a recap. So now we have to understand a quick walkthrough, but understanding in terms of CUI, you have to understand what type of CUI you touch, that you manage, right, within your contract. We have talked about the CUI data lifecycle very quickly, but you understand what is the best way to get an understanding in terms of the people, technologies, and applications that should be in scope. And then once you know what is in scope, then start making a list of assets. What should be the assets for the scope, right? Okay, and here is one of the interesting questions that we always get, right? What do we do with a CUI? How do we know what is CUI if it's not marked, right? And that's very common, and that's introduced a lot of pain to a lot of organizations because we don't know how to protect it, right? So I will introduce this methodology to you and let's see if you can, if this will be helpful for you. I will say to look at the contract information, to look at the contract clauses, and see if a CUI is being protected, specify what CUI have to be protected. If it's not there, you probably want to reach out to the contract officer or your prime contractor contact to get a clarification. I understand a lot of companies have this problem getting the information directly from the contract officers. I get that. So let's go down a little bit more. So if you cannot get a clarification, you want to look at the CUI registry. CUI registry to see if you can identify what the CUI information you have might be falling into the CUI registry. Once you have this understanding, you are making an assumption. Obviously, you probably want to send your DoD contract officer or your prime contractor, the contacts, an email and say, these are the CUI that we believe should be in scope, and these are the type of CUI we think that should be in scope, should be protected, and we are planning on protecting these type of CUIs. So you have to take that initiative, because otherwise, if you are relying on the contractor, your prime contractor contact or your DoD contract officers, sometimes you will never get to that resolution, right? But if you actually put together some email and send it to them, hey, we have done our homework. These, based on the CUI registry, this is what we defined should be CUI within our contract. We are going to protect them as specified within the CUI registry. Are you okay with it? Right? If they say yes, just make it easier for them to say yes or no. If they say no, they will give you a little bit more reasoning, right? But if they say yes, keep that email in your contract package, even though it's not a formal agreement, but at least you have some agreement. So I know these are not a very straightforward process, but these are one of the process that I would recommend. If you are really cannot get the understanding in terms of cannot get an agreement from your contract officers or your prime contract contacts on what is CUI, this might be one of the approach that you can take. Okay, so here's my contact information. I know there is a lot more information, but today we're giving you a high level understanding in terms of CUI scoping and how do you approach it. I know there are more questions we can cover a little bit after this presentation. So here's my contact information. Feel free to contact me for any questions that you have. Yeah. So hand it back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks so much for that. I think I'm sure your presentation answered quite a few questions, but it absolutely answered two of the questions we got very explicitly in the ones. And just to kind of recap that, so we certainly got the question that said, how do I find CUI that is not marked in my environment? So that, that this was that last slide that Kyle presented. So, and as he mentioned, and as I talk with many of the primes out there, I would say that, the best way to do this is to get in contact with your prime. And let them know what you're doing, ask them any questions you have, but get that clarification around the contract documents.
Yep, absolutely.
And then absolutely the life cycle that you covered, Kyle, because that is the other, one of the other questions we got is, what's the best questions to ask to determine whether a system is a covered system or not?
Right. And yeah, I think the data lifecycle is definitely a good way to do it. And also, there are a few different type of CUI asset that was covered, that was discussed. So use that as a guidance as well. That was based on the CUI scoping guide.
Great. So we're going to cover those. We're going to cover a few more questions in just a minute. I just want to please ask everybody to, within the YouTube description, there is an exit poll. We'd really appreciate it if you took some time to fill out that exit poll. That lets us know how we're doing. It also helps us plan for additional topics that you'd like to see covered in these webinars. So we also got the question of kind of where are we today? And the explicit question was, is level 2 the same as NIST 800-171? And today that answer is yes. right? So the CMMC standards are following the NIST 800-171. Right now, it is those same 110 controls that we see. But please understand that where we are today, right, and this pertains to the DFARS clauses you see there. So it's those 70 series of DFARS clauses. They say, you need to be NIST 800-171 compliant, and you need to have done a self-assessment and gotten your SPRS score. You should have then gone into SPRS, enter your cage code, and gone ahead and input that score into that system. So that's kind of where we are today. Where we are in if you will, in relation to CMMC 2.0 is that's currently in the rulemaking process. The last we heard is that they expect to finalize that in, I believe, the May of 2023 timeline, with it then the expectation that it would be in the DFARS contract clauses by October of 2023. Kyle, is that what is your understanding as well?
Yes. Yeah, the May 2023, once they release their interim rule, they are going to follow by 2 months of 60 days of the public comments. But my bet is that they are going to probably include this into their new contract in the new fiscal year 2024, which starts in October 1st.
Right.
But the official date we hear from the DoD is July 2023.
Right. And I think the May date came based on the last go around that said they expected that to be moved to the left 2 months. So I think that gets us to the May date that we're talking about.
Right. Exactly. Some people say March, but I think May, it might be a safe bet for May.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So on the Exostar side, if you've just started your journey around this, Exostar has some applications as well as some assistance we do within that, within this area. If you need some assistance in building the policies that you need to implement around 800-171, and or you need some help with that initial assessment of how you're doing with 800-171, and then lead into CMMC, Exostar has two applications: Policy Pro, which helps you build those policies; Certification Assistant, which allows you to do that self-assessment of how you're doing against those controls. And both of these applications are SaaS applications, and they both have the CMMC requirements also built into them today. So they also walk you through building these policies for CMMC and doing an assessment around CMMC itself as well. Then if, as Kyle mentioned, one of the things you need to consider around this is where you store that CUI information and how you share it out with others, either within your organization or across that organization. Exostar has products that help in that sharing and that storage of information in our managed Microsoft 365 for CMMC. And then if you are a prime that or even a subcontractor that also works with third parties, you do need to flow down those DFARS clauses. You need to determine how your supply chain is doing with their compliance. So we also have an application called our onboarding module, which allows you to track how your supply chain across that and how they're doing in their compliance. So if any of these areas interest you, please reach out to Exostar. We'd be more than happy to show you demonstrations or talk with you about these solutions as well. We both Policy Pro and Certification Assistant also do have free trials. So you can sign up for those and get started working on those today if you'd like to. There are some no-cost resources out there. Kyle, during his presentation, mentioned the locations where you can go to get what is CUI information, and how best to define that. These are some links to some additional no-cost resources out there for you. And now we're going to go ahead and dive a little more into the explicit Q&A that came across before. So let's see. Okay, so Kyle got this one. So is financial and PII considered CUI?
Only if it is included in your contract, within the context of contract, because when we are talking about CUI, we are really based on the contract. If you have a grant, that's a corporate agreement or whatever you want to specify within that contract or agreement. Is this a financial information or PII? Is that part of the contract, kind of the scope within your contract? If it is, yes. If it's not, then no. If it's something that's only included to your personal information, personal identifiable information of your employee, but within your contract, you are not required to protect that information, then I would say PII of your employee is not part of the CUI where you actually have to protect under the regulation.
Great. So have a question about that system boundary. So this question says, if I create a sub-information system within my organization and I separate it by hardware and firewalls, and that's what I consider my area for processing and transmitting CUI. What about those things that I use to send log files to or resources outside that sub-information system, but they're part of my overall organization's infrastructure? Are those part of my scope? And how do I and what do I consider those?
Yeah, so in terms of the system, I think it really depends on how you set up. If you have the information, if the log information is within your, it's processing some of the log, and that you are going to be using log to identify if there are going to be, if you experience a compromise, if you are going to be using the log system, log management system to investigate, right? So that become part of your scope. You probably want to include that as your security protection asset in that case. But it really depends. I think that answer might vary, but based on what I see, if you have the log, that's actually not necessarily include the CUI information, but if you have that log information that is going to be help you for your security protection, yes, that will be probably falling into the security protection assets.
Thanks. Another about those boundaries, and this is when you're dealing with those cloud providers out there. So how do we demonstrate compliance with the standards when part of the system is provided by third parties, such as things like Salesforce or Microsoft's Azure solutions, things like that? How do I, if you will, include those in my boundary?
Right. Yeah. So you definitely want to see if they're, for example, if you are using Microsoft or Salesforce to track and to store that CUI information, yeah, that is going to be within your scope. And if this is in scope, then you probably want to reach out. I would suggest you to reach out to Microsoft Azure or Salesforce. They may already have a place where they give you this information already. I know Microsoft Azure, they have the information that provided in their CMMC compliance page where you can get the information about their FedRAMP. FedRAMP is a cloud certification that's required by the government if you are using their software, cloud software to process the CUI information. That will require you to have, that will require the service provider to meet the not the CMMC, FedRAMP, moderate and above, right? So that's where you go to Microsoft or Azure or Salesforce to see where is the FedRAMP certification. And also they should have something called customer share responsibility metrics, and that will define what kind of controls they have taken So you can inherit and say these responsibility, for example, physical security. You don't have any physical security. They have to make sure that physical security is done properly. So that is some responsibility that's going to be falling on Microsoft and Azure, right? And the access control, you have to grant. You probably have to authorize people in terms of who should have access to your environment. But then Microsoft, they're only managing the actual platform, right? So there are going to be some shared responsibility in that case when you're talking about the access control. So these are the different things that you want to obtain the FedRAMP certification and also customer shared responsibility metrics from your service provider. And once you have that provider, you can determine what controls that you want to inherit from your service providers.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So I know you work with a number of manufacturers out there, Kyle, and so got this question about, do you have any advice for physical security for small machine shops with kind of an open floor plan, or kind of an open bay kind of system, and in both the security of CUI and that kind of environment?
Yes. So I think it depends on the size of the company. If you have a open area, I think the best way to do it is if you cannot secure the entire building or the entire area, can you secure the packet or something? Maybe it's the paper, or maybe it's the kiosk that you actually use to download the file, right? Or actually look at the drawings. Can you have like a badge system when you maybe every user have some kind of a badge. You go in, fingerprint or badge, you can actually scan and see the access the kiosk and take a look at the drawing. If you have something that's physical, a lot of manufacturers actually have the physical kind of like a bag, right? A bag or a folder with just the drawings, the physical drawings that people travel from station to station. You probably want to consider consider this the secure the manufacturing floor. Maybe you want to have some kind of a security, say folder itself. You probably want to have some kind of a secure have a specific area, maybe specific area that you store this. When you're done, put it back. When you are working on it, at least the person who is running these type of CUI information, they are working on this CUI information. They should have at least a line of sight in terms of where this folder is located, right? Understanding where is that located within the manufacturing floor. When they are done, put it back to a secure location. Maybe it's a file cabinet where you lock it at night, something like that. I don't think it have to be very, very complicated process, but at least you want to secure it to the reasonably securing them if it's physical. All right.
Absolutely. Great. And I think people, because so much is focused on IT, I think too many people always think about, the, if you will, the data itself, but sometimes that data is hard data, right? And obviously in manufacturing floor, sometimes it is those physical assets that you need to think about the security of those.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
and as you described, there are some ways to secure those things as well, which is great.
Yep, and we can definitely, that's how it all depends on how you design your controls. So you want to actually design the control that's reasonable for your environment as well. Don't overcomplicate it,
Right.
the controls.
Absolutely. Here's a question we often get just around CMMC itself. So it says the CMMC 2.0 level 2 requirements say that a subset of companies would not need to be audited. Any indication of what companies will fall into this subset?
Right. So when CMMC 2.0 was introduced, there's something called bifurcation. That means some part of the CMMC level 2 will do self-assessment. That's non-prioritized CUI. Then there's a prioritized CUI. Then you go for the full third-party assessment by C3PL, Certified Third-Party Assessment Organization. But what we heard from the DoD CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, is that this sounds all very good, but in terms of implementation, is going to be very, very difficult for DoD. So what we have heard from DoD is there are going to be very, very, very small number of companies that will be able to do the self-assessment. Most of the companies falling into the CMMC level 2, they will have to get third-party assessed. They have not changed their standing, but in the final rule, they might finalize in terms of what is the actual meaning of self-assessment for level 2.
Right. Okay. Great. And so, since your organization is currently a candidate for one of those C3PO, this is a good question for you.
Sure.
So, what are examples of artifacts used to show alignment with those descriptors? Some are obviously, while obviously others are left up to interpretation. But what are you looking for to, if you will, both show that you've got a policy in place and that you're actually doing something about that policy?
Right. So I think there's a lot of time we're going to be based on your policies, procedures, and what you documented in the SSP, right? If your SSP say, right, we have the password length is just an example, right? Password length of 12 characters, and we force the user to change password every 90 days, and we manage this through Active Directory group policy, the GPO. Then we're going to say, great, this is all good. Then show us. You might have the screenshot already, but we might actually just say, can you actually show us? And this is what the DIBCAC, which is the DoD DIBCAC, the assessment organization, do as well. They'll go out and say, can you show us the actual Active Directory GPO? You should be able to actually get to your Active Directory, open up the GPO, and show like, hey, here's the password related GPO, the group policy. And this is how we defined it within the policy. And as you can see, we have the policy shows password length is 12, and we force them to change the password every 90 days. Something like that. We'll take a screenshot, and that will become a evidence or artifacts. And again, artifacts based on what we have heard from DoD, it stays within the organization seeking for certification, OSCs. So you will keep all the artifacts. We won't take that offsite.
Great. So we got kind of three questions that are very, very closely related, and they're all kind of about, does this apply to me? So we've got, if no DoD DFARS mandate exists, am I required to conform? I'm new to these requirements. How do I know if I have to comply? And I'm a small compliance lab. We don't really handle any FCI or CUI. And how do I fit into this? So kind of how do I know if these things apply to me?
Right. So if there is no requirement, if you think there is no requirements and that from the CUI registry, you don't handle any of the information, then it may not apply to you. However, I would say level 2 doesn't apply to you, but level 1, that's when you have to protect the federal contract information. Federal contract information is anything that's owned or you own or actually use something that you created for the government, right, under the contract. And this could be the statement of work or some of the procurement information, right? So FCI is pretty broad. The level of protection is going to be a lot lower than the level 2. They only have 17 practices. But I would say if you are not handling any of the CUI information, if you are part of that supply chain, for the defense contract, you may still have the FCI, the federal contract information. So you probably want to check, if you still within that supply chain have the FCI, yeah, you probably still need to comply with the CMMC level 1. But as you mentioned earlier, I think it's the best. If you don't have any CUI information, or if you are COTS, that's another topic, commercially off-the-shelf product vendors, you can discuss, open up this discussion with your prime or your DoD contract officers and have that discussion. Say, based on the information, you have to do your homework. These are the information that we have, we handle, and these are based on the CUI registry. This information we handle do not fall into any of the CUI registry. Therefore, we believe we only need to have a CMMC level 1, or hey, if we are COTS, can we go through the determination with you? And then have you determined we are COTS, then we are exempt. So I think there are some ways around it, but you have to do your homework first.
Absolutely. And I would always start with that contract you have, right? Look at those contracts, see what you have, talk with your legal team, make sure they're comfortable with that decision. And then, as you said, talk to who you're actually contracted with to figure out what their expectation is as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, so everyone, I want to thank everybody for your participation today. Kyle, thanks so much for joining us. It was a great discussion. Really enjoyed it. If you have any questions after today, please reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.